people, but we as a society, we manipulate people for our benefit to spend money mostly, right? Let's see. On the phone is Audra Wolfe. She's an editor. She's an historian. She's a contributor to the Washington Post, The Atlantic. She got a podcast. I love podcasts called American History Tellers. Oh, I'm going to have to subscribe to that one. I listen to podcasts in my car.
Yeah, you see, you really enjoy them.
I do. I really do.
Fascinating.
The book is called Freedom's Laboratory, The Cold War Struggle for the Soul of Science. Audra Wolfe, good morning. Again, now that we're on the air, it's an honor to have you on our show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Where are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm in Philadelphia.
So tell me about the beginnings of this book. Was there something that kind of, like a genesis, the moment where you said, you know what? I'm noticing this a lot in history and in modern day, this whole connection between freedom and use of science.
Well, I thought I was writing a book originally about a geneticist by the name of Bentley Glass, who had a reputation for being a civil libertarian. He was very involved with the Maryland ACLU. He famously refused to sign a loyalty oath in 1960. But as I started spending time in his archival papers in an archive in Philadelphia, I started to realize that he had all sorts of connections to government agencies, sometimes intelligence agencies, sometimes the State Department. He even did some consulting for the State Department in occupied Germany in 1950. And I started to realize this guy is not an oppositional figure. I had completely misunderstood this man's role in kind of 1950s America. And it turned out that he was just the tip of the iceberg. Most of the scientists who were speaking out on behalf of scientific freedom and academic freedom in the 1950s, most of them were cooperating with the federal government in one way or another about promoting American values abroad. So at the same time that they might be being investigated by the FBI for being suspected communists, the State Department was sending them abroad to talk about American values and kind of the American way of life.
And how does science associate itself with social lifestyles, I guess? How does that happen? I mean, how does it benefit to incorporate a scientific angle to that?
Well, I think to understand that, we have to back up to why the United States was doing propaganda in the first place during this time period. And so the Cold War was in many ways an ideological war between communism and capitalism. The Americans like to think of that as between freedom and slavery. Because this was supposedly about freedom, a victory by force would have been hollow. So the United States was really deeply invested in the idea of persuading people around the world to choose the American way of life through free will. And science came into these programs because science was part of American culture. So some of these programs were about, arts or literature or sports. If you've heard of jazz diplomacy, that was definitely sort of part of these same programs. But ideas about science were part of these programs too. So the idea that science and freedom and objectivity, that these were really central to the way things worked in the West, and that was very different than how things worked under communism. These were absolutely part of 1950s and 1960s propaganda campaigns.
And you brought up the phrase atoms for peace.
Yes. So Atoms for Peace was a program to show the world that the atomic bomb could have peaceful uses, that it could be used for medical uses, for cancer treatment, that it could produce energy too cheap to meter. The interesting thing about Atoms for Peace, though, is that it was also a national security initiative. The idea was to force the nuclear powers to contribute some amount of uranium, enriched uranium, to an international stockpile. And the United States theory was that they could win either way, that this was absolutely a winning proposition. Because if the Soviet Union refused to participate in Atoms for Peace, that would be a way of showing the world that the United States was a better friend, a better collaborator. And if the Soviet Union did decide to cooperate, it would have to give up some of its fissile materials. So this is like kind of a winning strategy to both promote American attitudes about science and possibly a non-proliferation strategy.
So do we use science? Okay, I used the example in the beginning of the cigarette ad that in radio, and again, before my time, we were guilty of helping to spread the word that scientists have proven cigarette smoking was safe, especially if it was a Camel or whatever other brand was being sold. Is that the same thing, except with government instead of like radio people? They're using science to persuade somebody to believe, well, this is the best way to do it because it's proven somehow?
Well, so propaganda is a spectrum. And when we're talking about misleading advertising about, say, the health effects of tobacco, that's an example of, advertising is certainly meant to persuade, but that is also perhaps not truthful. Propaganda isn't necessarily untrue. Some propaganda can be true. But the bigger point of propaganda is that you're absolutely advocating a single point of view for your own goals. So, it's not necessarily bad to say that science operates better under conditions of freedom. But, that was definitely an idea that the United States wanted to promote. And, that was part of the story. Now, science came into propaganda in other ways. There's also a science of propaganda. For instance, the ways that you might design your communication strategies to best convince people how to be persuaded. And so scientists were involved in propaganda in that way, too, in helping the government figure out what kinds of appeals might be appealing. But even on a technical level, things like trying to understand how to unjam radio broadcasts, because the United States had radio towers all over Western Europe that they were trying to beam behind the Iron Curtain, and the Soviet Union was jamming those broadcasts. So science is involved in propaganda in a lot of different ways during this time period.
And that propaganda is more dangerous now because we have more than TV and radio. We have social media. I mean, and when you talk about domestic prosperity, we're coming on to the Christmas season. We work at a mall. We see a lot of people shopping and everything. And yet when January 1st comes, there are news reports saying how poor the shopping season was.
I would say it's been a very strange couple of years to be a historian of propaganda, and maybe I'll just leave it at that. But it's been an odd time to have a lot of deep knowledge about kind of how you do secret campaigns or how you do campaigns of persuasion that maybe don't always announce themselves.
I had a teacher who gave me this example to understand propaganda. The two schools are going to a track meet, and unfortunately, they only have one runner from each school. And the school number one has his guy come in first, and school number two has his guy come in second. So school number one says, we came in first place. School number two says, our competitor came in second to last. We came in second. I said, okay, now I understand propaganda, I guess. But,
right.
So when we is there a historically, is there an example maybe in history where propaganda was in fact used, but with good intention? Like it wasn't like for self-serving purposes, but rather maybe to persuade somebody to, lose weight, let's say, or something of that sort. But that would be a personal thing, not an international thing. Do we have those examples?
Sure. Let me give you a very specific example that's still around today. The National Science Foundation is a federal agency that supports scientific research, and it was founded in 1950. The conversations about what the National Science Foundation should look like had started right after World War II. Most foreign policy leaders thought that the United States had won World War II because of the atomic bomb. And so they wanted to make sure that the United States was investing in basic research, because the story that they told was that the atomic bomb came out of doing basic undirected research. And they drew a contrast to how scientific research was conducted in other countries. They said that that the reasons that the German Nazis hadn't been able to develop the bomb was because they were very directed and because they had distorted science in a lot of different ways. And then they also looked to the Soviet Union, where scientific planning was really big, that science needed to be directed in the Soviet Union to meet 5-year goals. And so American planners were looking at these other examples, these exaggerated understandings of how science was working under the Nazis and how science was working in the Soviet Union. And they said, we need the opposite of that. So the National Science Foundation was put together as an organization led by scientists, dedicated to basic research, where scientists would be really making the decisions. And this was both, this was a real thing that existed. So this was a case where propaganda and kind of ideology had really concrete effects. And this kind of changed how science was being funded for a long time. And then the United States could tell the rest of the world, hey, this is how we do science in the United States. See how different this is than how science operates under totalitarian regimes. Now, what's interesting about this is that during the 1950s, the NSF was only funding a little tiny bit of science. Most of the funding for basic research for science was actually coming from military agencies. But
really?
So the United States was really highlighting the role of the National Science Foundation as an alternative to communism. So, these propaganda can have very concrete effects. And again, propaganda isn't necessarily bad, but it is a sort of structured approach to describing your messaging and promoting a particular message to targeted audiences.
So let me ask you about one that comes across these microphones all the time. It's global warming, and I'm not trying to be starting a political argument on that, but I'm just telling you from Robin and my perspective, when this subject comes up, we have people who say it's been scientifically proven, and we have people who say that's propaganda. And so, and to me, I just do a radio show. I don't know, because I haven't gone out and studied the temperatures. All I can do is listen to what people are saying. And people who call into the show, who flash credentials, so we have to respect them, they disagree with each other. So how would I know what's even right and what's wrong?
Well, science operates by consensus, and the vast majority of scientists who work on this topic agree that climate change is real and has been caused by humans. So there's a pretty strong scientific consensus about that. But what we have in some of the public controversy about climate change is maybe some confusion about what counts as expertise, or maybe some confusion about how science really operates. And so, one of the things that came out of some of these Cold War ideas was that science should always be hyper objective, and that science is only based on facts, that there is this almost parody of how science should operate. And so now what's been happening, particularly in climate change, is that some bad faith actors are promoting other stories about what the science of climate change looks like. And they're using these ideas of how science should operate, all right? So they're saying, well, the data that you have isn't 110% perfect, so therefore we need to reject this data because it's not good science. Good science never looks 100% perfect. That's not how science works. The science does operate through a consensus process and through peer review, and scientists have ways of coming to agreement, but it's messy. It has never been as clear cut as the way that we talk about the scientific method, or the way that science was being described in some of this Cold War propaganda. Science is messy, but we need it, right? We absolutely need it.
Freedom's Laboratory is the book, The Cold War Struggle for the Soul of Science. Does that include social things as well, or is it all legal things as far as legislative things?
Absolutely, it includes social things. A really good example is I have a chapter about textbook translations. This sounds really boring, but it's actually not, so let me explain. And actually, since you're in Florida, it involves a scientist who spent the end of his career at the University of Florida, a biologist by the name of Arnold Grobman, who was head of the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study, which is a textbook reform program in the early 1960s. And this textbook became a tool to promote American values abroad. This was a textbook that came out of post-Sputnik curriculum reforms, so it highlighted what they called the nature of inquiry, that science isn't a collection of facts. Science is a way of thinking about the world. And this textbook turned out to be a really good vehicle to promote American values abroad. So there's this amazing story in which a whole bunch of different government agencies, both overt government agencies, covert government work, and even some private foundations are all supporting translations of this work, particularly in Asia. So USAID was funding this work. The CIA was actually funding some of these translations via a cover agency. The Rockefeller and Ford foundations were supporting these translations, and international groups like UNESCO were supporting it. So it's a fascinating case in which we see both overt, covert, and private groups all doing the same work to promote a certain vision of science in the international scene. And part of why it was successful was because it was so subtle. These books didn't announce, hey, this is an American approach to doing science. These books simply promoted a particular point of view about how science should operate and how scientists should behave. And then it was customized for local audiences. And it really transformed the way that biology was taught around the world.
And when you did all of your research with all of the different documents, some of those documents at one time must have been classified.
Absolutely. And some of them were only declassified fairly recently. Large swaths of them were declassified around 2005 and 2008. And I did some of the Freedom of Information Act requests myself. Now, that being said, a lot of the stories in this book fall into the category of secrets hiding in plain sight. I mentioned the CIA's cover organizations earlier. The CIA had many cover relationships that were exposed in 1967. And the thing about a successful cover is that when it's successful, you can talk about it. So until 1967, organizations that would receive funding from these cover organizations, they would list it in their annual reports. So all that you need to do is to know that they're cover organizations, right? The information's there, but they have innocuous names like the Asia Foundation. And I should say the Asia Foundation still exists as a legitimate non-governmental agency. It hasn't received CIA funding in quite some time, but it did until 1967. But so you can see it listed in these organizational documents, and if you know its background, suddenly the story starts to look very different than if you just think it's a regular private foundation.
Oh my gosh, it's so interesting. Another one that comes to mind is the vaccine cause of autism. I cannot tell you how many times I've had doctors / scientists who disagree on that whole subject. And again, as the general public, and I guess Robert and I are part of that, it's like we are listening, we're intelligent, but we haven't done the studies. So we're listening to people who have done the studies, and I don't know if there's an agenda. In other words, is the propaganda supposed to be making me believe one thing over another for a reason? I don't know. Does anything show up in the work you've done regarding that particular subject?
I can't speak specifically to that, except to say that vaccines in general are an excellent public health innovation. But what I can say is that what these kind of controversies really point to is the difference between technocracy and democracy, right? Democracy, we need scientific expertise and scientific advice to make good decisions, and policymakers need that advice to make good decisions. At the same time, scientists aren't necessarily the people who should be making those decisions unless they've run for office, right? We don't live in a technocracy. We do live in a democracy. And so part of what's really changed over the past 20 years or so is that scientists haven't quite known how to justify their own authority. They often rely on this Cold War language that, science should by definition, be objective, that science should by definition be empirical, that really relying on scientific advice is one of the hallmarks of how we do things in the West. This language was really resonant during the Cold War. And it's less resonant now. And scientists have really struggled to find a new language to show that they're involved in the public good. So when members of the public are really concerned about things like, vaccinations, often this is a deeper conversation about resistance to being told what to do by other people. And so scientists haven't quite managed to find good language, persuasive language to talk about why we should listen to them.
The numbers that you hear from the people who believe that the vaccines do cause autism are are enough evidence that I think somebody should look into that, and somebody who can do that. This is such a fascinating topic. Audra J. Wolfe, the book is called Freedom's Laboratory. I have a copy of the book. If I have a listener who would like it, give me a call. I'll make sure I leave it here for you. The rest of us have to go buy it. I found it on Amazon. Do you have a different website you'd like to recommend, or a website dedicated to you or the book?
I do. I have my own website, audrajwolfe.com, and I'm sure my publisher would appreciate it if I told you to go to them directly. They're Johns Hopkins University Press. You can Google it, and you can get the book directly from them or from your local bookstore.
All right. Audra, thank you so much. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Good stuff. We'll be right back.
The folks at Honey Baked Ham remind us that now is the time to make your holiday entertaining plans. The holidays are coming up fast. Reserve your ham, turkey now. What about all the parties and gatherings? Honey Baked Ham is the answer there, too. They cater for intimate meetings or large parties. Again, reserve now. Honey Baked Ham is located on Southwest 27th Avenue behind Best Buy. Stop in or call 352-861-0011. Again, 861-0011. Honey Baked Ham, the world's best ham, turkey, roast beef, sides, desserts. $99 is all. $99 is all. Take this down and pass it around. $99 is all.
What?
The special, Robin, from Optical Outlets. Just $99 for 2 pair of no-line progressive bifocals and an eye exam.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, 2 pair of no-line progressive bifocals and eye exam from Optical Outlets. We need to tell all our listeners about Optical Outlets. $99 is all. Take this down and pass it around. $99 is all.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala.
Fox News, I'm Chris Foster. A hand recount of ballots in Florida's Senate races started. It's still too close to call by state law. Absentee and rejected ballots in Georgia are being reviewed in the governor's race there.
Republican Brian Kemp leads Democrat Stacey Abrams by over 50,000 votes. Abrams hopes to force a runoff. Both have filed legal challenges, though Kemp's campaign maintains that he'll prevail.
Fox's Jeff Manasso. The Justice Department tells Fox it was a mistake naming WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in a court document.
The Justice Department inadvertently named him in a court filing in an unrelated case, stating that charges would need to remain sealed until Assange is arrested in connection with the charges in the criminal complaint and can therefore no longer evade or avoid arrest and extradition. It's not immediately clear what charges Assange could be facing, but Special Counsel Robert Mueller has looked into WikiLeaks' publication of hacked emails during the 2016 presidential campaign.
Fox's Rachel Sutherland. This is Fox News.
It's the holiday sales event at Ford. It's a big deal, and we're busy making preparations to get you the best deals of the year. Because unlike Santa's presents, ours don't just magically appear. At Ford, ours are built in real factories, where pickup trucks come with best-in-class towing and payload, where SUVs are built with available features like terrain management and driver assist technologies, and where every bolt, stitch, and line of code is tested and tested again. But you don't have to write Santa a letter to get these presents. Naughty or nice, just come see your Ford dealer during our holiday sales event for our best offers of the year. Ford, built for the holidays.